did as part of my PhD research, interviews that I did with about 45 US and UK political, diplomatic, and military elites. So with that, I'll begin with the Libya case. So Libya's uprising began on the 15th of February 2011. It was driven by socioeconomic grievances and the Gaddafi regime's arrest of a local human rights lawyer. In response, the Gaddafi regime initiated a violent crackdown, which then quickly escalated. On the 26th of February, the Security Council passed Resolution 1970, which condemned Gaddafi's actions, imposed a series of international sanctions, and referred Libya to the criminal court. When the measures taken under Resolution 1970 failed to deter Gaddafi and he kept going, a second resolution proposed by France, the UK, and Lebanon, Resolution 1973, was passed on the 17th of March 2011 under the auspices of the responsibility to protect. This resolution formed the legal basis for the international military campaign against the Gaddafi regime that began on the 19th of March. A big factor driving the Security Council action was what I call the Benghazi moment. Gaddafi had publicly announced that his troops were marching toward Benghazi and that a siege of the city was imminent. He essentially dared the international community to stop him. And throughout the world, there was a sense of shock and horror at what Gaddafi was doing. It prompted international actors to ask themselves whether they wanted to stand by and do nothing, as yet another case of mass atrocities loomed on the African continent. On another level, the Security Council dynamics were critical to how the international response to the Libya crisis unfolded. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, the UK was the penholder in the Security Council on Libya. Penholding meant that the UK had the lead on drafting and tabling resolutions, chairing debates and meetings in which the UK spoke first. In a sense, they basically controlled the Libya issue in the Security Council. The next issue was the Security Council membership. The council at that time was composed then of countries such as South Africa, Germany, Lebanon, and Brazil, some of whom harbored desires of permanent membership. They were eager to be seen as part of the solution. Furthermore, a critical moment in the council was the defection of Libya's representative at the council, Mohamed Shalgam, which became a deciding factor in the adoption of Resolution 1973. The reason this was so important was because Shalgam had been defending Gaddafi for weeks at the UN. He then abruptly switched sides. He took to the floor at the Security Council, and then he compared Gaddafi to Hitler, and he begged the international community to stop him. A final key factor was support by the Arab League for intervention. Once the Arab League backed the intervention, Russia and China could no longer stand in the way of it. European factors at play in the response to the uprising, in particular the UK and France, were complex. First, there was a values element. Amid the calls by protesters in many Arab Spring countries for more political freedoms and socioeconomic reform, Cameron and Sarkozy wanted to be seen as being on the right side of the response to Libya. At the time, Cameron had a strong position domestically in that he had a coalition government. And
Josephine, is your screen off? Is your mic off? Josephine, I think your mic's off.
Is it on?
Yeah.
There we go. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened.
Back up a wee bit.
What was the last thing you heard?
Was it Cameron?
Hitler?
Yep. Okay, compared Gaddafi to Hitler, I can pick up right there. Sorry, I don't know what happened. So a final key factor was support by the Arab League for intervention. Once the League backed the intervention, Russia and China could no longer stand in the way of it. There were European factors at play in the response to the uprising as well, in particular the US, the UK, and France. First, there was a values element. Amid the calls by protesters in many Arab Spring countries for more political freedoms and socioeconomic reform, Cameron and Sarkozy wanted to be seen as being on the right side of the response to Libya. At the time, Cameron had a strong position domestically in that he had a coalition government and had established himself as a strong prime minister. Sarkozy, on the other hand, was in a different situation. He was an unpopular president facing re-election in 2012. He was seeking a revitalization of the badly tarnished French foreign policy in the Arab world, which further incentivized Sarkozy to join forces with Cameron in pushing for intervention in Libya. Then there was the national interest piece. There was a desire to preserve EU-Libya ties governing trade, investments, and technology, curbing European-bound migration flows departing from Libya, and reinforcing the humanitarian personas as they saw them of Cameron and Sarkozy. Gaddafi's violence was seen as disrupting all of these things. Iraq also loomed large in the background, as the decision to militarily intervene in Libya gained momentum, Cameron and Sarkozy wanted to show that they could lead an intervention that could succeed where the intervention in Iraq was seen to have failed. And finally, there was a need to avoid another Srebrenica on their watch. Many international actors remembered the failures that led to the Srebrenica massacre. It was thus an important factor in how the crisis in Libya was viewed. As for the US, as it weighed how to respond to Gaddafi, there were several considerations at play. Among them was that Washington didn't believe it had any interest in intervening in Libya per se. But the Arab Spring was prompting a reshift of how the US saw its interests in the region. For one, intervention was important to Cameron and Sarkozy. It then became about not whether the US had interest in intervening in Libya per se, but whether it had interest in intervening for the sake of alliance reciprocity and security. Enabling capabilities were another factor. US capabilities, particularly aircraft such as tankers, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance technology and staff were essential to carrying out the intervention. This led the US to implement the first phase of the intervention before handing it off to NATO, although the US remained quietly involved in the background. Finally, the crisis was viewed through the lens of competing priorities. The US was busy recovering from Iraq and strategically refocusing in Afghanistan, managing preparations for the 2012 presidential election, assisting with the emergency response to the tsunami in Japan that triggered a meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear reactor, countering Iran, and addressing the fallout from the 2008 global financial crash. The UK was dealing with many of these same issues, as well as other ones such as preparations for the 2012 Summer Olympic Games, which is a major national security event for Britain. On the Syria side, Syria's uprising, which got underway in early 2011, was driven by a complicated history, as well as political and economic motives. The Assad regime immediately met the demonstrations with brutal crackdowns. There was violence against civilians by government security forces and mass arrests and imprisonment, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of people and wounding thousands. This is in the very beginning. Yet Syria saw a very different reaction to its uprising compared with the international response to, say, the Libya crisis. There's many reasons for this, but I'm just going to mention a few. First, the ways in which the international community, particularly the US and the UK, initially interpreted Syria's societal conditions, power dynamics, and the uprising itself really mattered to what came after in terms of decision-making on the crisis. Syria's uprising was unfolding in the shadow of big interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Libya, none of which were perceived as having progressed optimally, despite, particularly in the case of Libya, how well intended their aims. Consequently, these interventions shaped the discourse and debates in Washington and London about the goal of a concerted response to Assad's violence, as well as the kind of operation needed to achieve it. Furthermore, in interviews that I conducted, a common idea was that the window for intervention in Syria was seen to have been the biggest from 2011 to early 2013. But the focus then was not necessarily on intervention, as there was a belief that Assad would soon lose power, that there was a Sunni majority that opposed him, that the rebels had a lot of momentum, and that the Syrian regime was not equipped to withstand the onslaught. But by the time it became clear that those assumptions were wrong, the international community had lost a lot of time and momentum in terms of developing a coherent strategy towards Syria. Some of the people I spoke with indicated that the decision-making on the Syria crisis never really recovered from that initial error. The second factor was that Syria was a much different and much harder case than others, Libya in particular. There was Russian benefaction. Other factors that shaped how international actors viewed it included no viable or unified opposition inside Syria to support, the proximity of a multitude of armed extremist and/or terrorist groups, and the involvement of Iran and the proxies it supported. On the diplomatic side, the Security Council dynamics were different than what they had been in Libya. Security Council activity was much more of a fractured process. Russia and China's unwillingness to support almost any sort of move, such as referring Syria to the ICC, was conditioned in large part by the feeling that they had been manipulated on the Libya resolutions. In their view, they had voted for intervention, only to see Libya or Gaddafi get killed and the country plunged into civil war. They didn't want to make that same mistake again. Essentially, what Russia and China opposition in the Security Council did was that it neutralized, through the use of the veto, the ability of the Security Council to take the lead on working for a peaceful resolution of Syria's conflict. This is why so much of the Syria conflict, in terms of policymaking by international actors, happened outside the framework of the UN, although the UN was always there. The third and final point is that it soon became evident to the international community that the Syria conflict had what some of my interviewees referred to as a built-in escalation dynamic. Initially, both the US and the UK's approach to the Syria crisis could be summarized as a lack of bandwidth due to the limited number of simultaneous Arab Spring crises that Western diplomats could handle at once. Certain issues were prioritized, such as Egypt, because of its size and status as a key Western ally in the Arab world, and Libya because of the intervention there. Syria, on the other hand, saw efforts to manage the developments as well as reasonably practical, although this later took different forms as Assad loyalists intensified their crackdowns. There was also a growing sense, according to many UK and US actors, that intervention in Syria could not be done in a limited, effective, and strategic way that would save vulnerable Syrian civilians while also upholding the national interests as Britain and American actors perceived it. The thinking was, if limited, carefully tailored actions didn't produce the result intended, there would be pressure to do more, to take greater action. And if that failed to achieve the result, the pressure would increase to do more, and nations would then become embroiled in the conflict. An important aspect of this thinking is what intervention in Syria would require. Some of my US and UK military interviewees stated that estimates for what intervention in Syria would require confirmed that major land, air, and amphibious forces would be needed at a tremendous cost. They added that intervention on this scale would have been possible only if the United States had been willing to commit. But from the beginning, Washington did not want to go down that road. So in conclusion, in the Libya and Syria cases, perceptions of both crises were shaped by factors such as the Iraq War, the controversies of the Libya intervention, domestic priorities, including the requirements for intervention, Security Council dynamics, Russia's role in Syria, and normative clashes, such as the notion that in Libya, it was seen as the intervention was much more about prevention, whereas in Syria, it was different. It was seen as much more about responding or reacting, and the inability to navigate that balance. And with that, with the interest of time, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Josephine. That was great. Okay, Ola, over to you. Ola, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's always good to be back in San Andreas, although virtually for now. I will try to share my screen to share the PowerPoint. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So I'll be speaking about the identity balance during the One Decade War. Well, implications of the 10 years uprising are multi-layered and transnational. They look lethal at all levels, political, socioeconomic, and humanitarian. They resonated across the region and even beyond. However, one of the most important implications of the uprising is the collapse of identity balance among Syrians. And it is indeed crucial to be examined because it would play an essential role in shaping any post-conflict Syria. Prior to the uprising, identity balance that Hafiz Assad carefully crafted was composed of Arabism as an umbrella identity under which Syrianism and Islamism follow. Yet, this balance was strongly shaken just after the outbreak of the uprising. Arabism declined and even seemed to be fading away, especially after the suspension of Syria's membership in the Arab League in November 2011. For Assad regime, what for long were dual shaqiqa, or considered as sister Arab states, are now enemies supporting his opponents and seeking to overthrow the regime. Even for the anti-Assad Syrians, support by Arab states was very disappointing. Many anti-Assad Syrians believed that the Arab world let them down. And on the other hand, many pro-Assad Syrians believe that Arab states betrayed Syria. A very popular song among protesters between 2011 2012, when protests were still taking place inside Damascus and other cities. So a very popular song was called Ya Arab Khazaltuna, Oh Arab, you failed us. And also this picture is for a popular drawing that was held during an anti-Assad protest, and which also was circulated.
Are you there, Ola?
Yes? You can hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, you're off for a bit there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes?
All right. So what Chris Phillips termed as everyday Arabism seems to be declining due to what I call everyday sectarianism. The polarization and manipulation of identities took place, and by many state and non-state actors, empowered Islamism at the expense of Arabism. Sectarian identities like Sunni Alawite are weapons on hands of political actors who utilize material and symbols to reproduce particular identity that serve their own interest. Many versions of Islamic identity being reproduced, like Sufi, Salafi, and Salafi-Jihadi on a daily basis. And indeed, it challenged the old version, or i.e., the pre-2011 Islamic identity. On the other hand, Syrian national identity is being reproduced as an inclusive identity for the secular and non-Muslim Syrians. For the first time ever, Syrian regime seeks to empower Syrian identity, emphasizing common history, Aramic language, and even created a new curriculum which recalls Syrian national figures and stress the glory of Syrian history. Well, this might sound surreal for Syrians of older generation, 80s and 90s, including me, who grew up to chant every day, Ummah Arabiya Wahida, one united.
I'm having trouble, Ola, hearing you. Connection seems bad. Seem to have lost you, Ola. Are you there, Ola?
Sorry about this.
Oh, you're back. Good.
Yeah, sorry about this. Like, I guess we have a snowstorm in New York, so the internet is kind of down. That's why. So tell me, where did I disconnect so I can repeat?
I'm not sure. I think you were talking about Syrianism and how it seems surreal to your generation who used to in Arabia.
Excellent. So I will take it from there. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Excellent. So on the other hand, Syrian national identity being reproduced, as we say, so it's like the secular opposition is also seeking to reproduce a Syrian national identity, charitable networks, political movements, communication tools, adopted national names like My Syria, Syrians Across Borders. All of them denounce sectarianism and seeking to unite Syrians. For instance, this banner was held during an anti-Assad protest in El Tel town in the suburbs of Damascus. It says, if we are Christian, we've been Christian for more than 2,000 years. If we are Muslims, we've been so for more than 1,400 years, but we have been Syrians for more than 10,000 years. Also, interestingly, secular Syrians with different political affiliations are now stressing the Syrian territorial map, taking a pride in wearing accessories or outfit that show the map. 10 years ago, this was not common at all. You would see Syrians wearing kufiyyah, emphasizing Arabism and pro-Palestinian stances. One would rarely see the map, the Syrian map, displayed anywhere. So, to conclude, although it functioned in a proper way for 40 years, the identity balance has collapsed with the outbreak of the uprising. The struggle for power is now between two identities, Syrianism and Islamism. Arabism, as umbrella identity, seems to be demising for the near future, as the golden age of pan-Arabism is gone forever, since the regional and international context of pan-Arabism are drastically changed with the series of peace deals between many other Arab states and Israel. So, Syrianism or Islamism, which of these identities had the power to redress the balance? And more importantly, which one of them would include all Syrians? It's yet to be seen, I'm afraid. Thank you. So that's it.
Thank you, Ola. That was
The
fascinating.
internet will disconnect.
I hope you can stay with it.
Yes,
Turn
thank
over
you so much.
We'll turn over to you, Aisha.
So can you hear me now, everyone?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about parts of one of my chapters, actually. And I just want to make an announcement that the focus in this talk will be mainly on the regime's rhetoric or the regime side instead of the opposition, basically because of the time's limit. So my talk today will be divided into two main points. The first point will discuss the regime's way of addressing the uprising and its narrative in Bahrain, and then the second aspect or the second point will focus mainly on the physical example or the physical element of the regime demolishment of the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain and attempt to portray the uprising within Bahrain as a sectarian uprising. So the Bahraini regime was able to survive the uprising that was witnessed back in 2011 and remain in power mainly due to the regional intervention. And the uprising itself was not a spring of the moment, and it wasn't the first time in Bahrain that such an unrest was witnessed. Bahrain has a rich history of different upheavals, if one would say, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000, and they have different socio-economical and political social movements and reasons that basically attributed to the outcome of different crisis throughout the history. The current, or what distinguished the 2011 from its previous unrest mainly is that the 2011 uprising was sectarianized, and we can basically attribute one of the main factors, not the only one, but one of the main factors that resulted in seeing the uprising as a sectarian uprising was the regional change of power within the region and the regime change within Bahrain, and basically the competition between both Saudi Arabia and Iran due to the Obama's administration agreement, or we could say acknowledgement of the Irani sphere of influence within the region with the nuclear agreement that basically spread concerns of or fears to other monarchies within the region, and especially in Saudi Arabia due to their eastern fields and that are basically heavily populated with the Shia population and the fear of domino effect. So with regards to the Bahraini regime's narrative or with in addressing the uprising, it mainly attempted to paint it or portray it as a Shia uprising, and the narrative was basically, it evolved and developed over the years. But at the first year, it attempted to portray it as a bad memory, bad days, foreign plot attempting to destabilize the government and topple it, and the narrative changed in relation to the change within the alliances within the region, and mainly to in 2017 with the Gulf dispute, where another accusation were added is basically allegedly accusing the opposition's activists, and even the people who participated in the uprisings or in the events, not the uprising, in the events of the 2011, with the charges such as terrorism and collusion with Qatar and spying on the government, and in addition to the steering or attempting to steer or foment sectarian strife within the country. The second part that basically shows us the physical elements of the regime attempt to sectarianize the uprising is the Pearl Roundabout itself. The Pearl Roundabout is basically the public area, and as we know that the public area is the state area where it basically could demonstrate its power. And within the Pearl Roundabout, it was basically the main point and the symbol that and somehow represented the pro-democratic calls at the early stages of the uprising. The demolishment act of the roundabout itself and the broadcasting of the events through national television is basically in itself an attempt of the state to show its power, and also at the same time trying to take control over the narrative and the symbolism associated to the national symbol of the Pearl Roundabout itself. This is a security act of the demolishment of the roundabout. However, it became a sectarian securitized act when they renamed the roundabout with an intersection that is called al-Faruq in reference to Al-Khalifa Umar al-Khattab, who was basically known as al-Faruq, as someone who distinguished between good and evil, and in some of the Shi'is interpretation is seen as one of the illegitimate ruler who took the rule instead of the Prophet family, Khalifa Ali, sorry. This is basically a clear sectarian provocation act that is basically an attempt of the regime of portraying the uprising and the symbols of the uprising as a failed Shi'i plot that basically attempted to overthrow the Sunni monarchy. Not only did they attempted to give it a sectarian act, but a sectarian meaning, but they also tried to control the narrative as well with erasing all of the images that contain the symbol itself. Where there is a coin in Bahrain, the 500 fils coin, it has the Pearl Roundabout engraved on it. It was pulled out of the market, and also with the postcard that had the symbol printed on them, it was also, they were also collected. The final point of my talk is basically on the recent, or one would say, the alterations between the different groups or different societies and villages within Bahrain, and their alterations with the regime itself. And you can see that there were different civil unrest that were witnessed, and whenever the anniversary of the uprising would come upon soon, and we're now in February, so in mid-February you would hear it in the news that there will be some of alterations between different communities and different Shi'i villages within Bahrain with the security forces, where the government, what did they do is basically is that they appoint security forces all around the area, and especially around the Shi'i villages, in order to contain and control all of the riots that they expect yearly, and they do happen yearly. And another recent effect or recent event that is popping up within the Bahraini news is the scandal of scholarship massacre, as they've labeled it. It's basically a hashtag that became popular, where the population and the activists in Bahrain, they're accusing the educational ministry of discriminating between the Sunni and the Shi'i high school students, and giving basically scholarship or quotes to more of the Sunni and regime loyalists families over the Shi'i sides of the society. And also another aspect or a sign that shows the regime continuous, unfortunately or sadly, continuous discrimination against the Shi'i citizens in Bahrain is their procedures that were taken during the COVID-19 restrictions last year, where the security forces were heavily existent and prevented much of the celebration that the Shia usually celebrate during Ashura last year. However, when it came to the National Day celebration, there was a critique that the security existence or assurance of the social distancing between the masses was not as heavy as it was in Ashura. And here where I will stop.
Thank you very much, Aisha. That was really interesting. So, over to you, Marta.
Thank you, Professor Nebush. And thank you to the Institute for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here with my colleagues as we discuss the Arab Spring 10 years later. And in the context of our discussion today, I will be focusing on Yemen, and more specifically on the connection between the events of the Arab Spring in Yemen and the collapse of the state, and the emergence of Al-Qaeda as a provider of governance in southern parts of Yemen. So in 2011, as the Arab Spring spread from Tunisia to other parts of the Arab world, protests also reached Yemen, a country that by then was already characterized by great state weakness, meaning that the government in Sana'a was not significantly present outside the capital. And all the peripheral areas of the country were de facto controlled by local power brokers. So in this context, as Yemen's disaffected youth, civil society organizations, and also tribal figures took to the streets of the capital in February 2011, the government adopted a heavy-handed response, as we observed in many parts of the Arab world, that further incensed the opposition to then President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Following this intensification of tensions between the government and the opposition, members from the ruling party defected. Key tribal leaders also turned their back on the government, and the country's security forces fractured into distinct armed units, each controlled by a different power broker and loyal to him. Additionally, the government was focusing its attention exclusively on Sana'a, disregarding the rest of the country, to the point that even the Yemeni military, the Yemeni army, was mostly withdrawn from peripheral governorates and was relocated around the capital. This situation, characterized by weak state power, growing insecurity, and widespread volatility, quickly turned into a golden opportunity for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Al-Qaeda affiliate based in Yemen that was founded officially in 2009. In fact, the leader of the Yemenite branch of Al-Qaeda, Nasir al-Bukhaishi, saw in the unfolding disorder and the spreading insecurity of 2011 of the Arab Spring an unmissable opportunity for his group to build the Yemeni Islamic Emirate that he had long desired. So regardless, despite the fact that actually the senior leadership of Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan and Afghanistan, by which I mean Osama bin Laden, who back then was still alive for a few more months, was against the decision of doing anything about Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Yemen was determined to take advantage of these opportunities suddenly offered by the Arab Spring and proceed to build the Islamic State. So shortly afterwards, in this context of protests, Al-Qaeda in Yemen created Ansar al-Sharia, supporters of Islamic law, as an insurgent arm whose purpose was kind of making people believe that there wasn't a real connection with Al-Qaeda, that clearly had a very negative brand. And together, Al-Qaeda and Ansar al-Sharia managed to expand throughout southern Yemen. They conquered the city of Jar in the governorate of Abiyan. From Jar, they moved to conquer Zinjibar, also in Abiyan. And they proceeded to control a strategic road that connects Abiyan to Shabwa, another southern governorate, and importantly connects also to the port city of Aden. After these territorial conquests, Al-Qaeda proceeded immediately to raise its black flag, proclaim an Islamic Emirate, and engage in activities of governance. Specifically, Al-Qaeda sought, and what is important, to some extent even managed, to provide to the people services that the central government in Sana'a with Saleh had been incapable of providing for years. Gas, drinkable water, electricity. So suddenly in the internet, it was possible to see videos posted by Al-Qaeda and Ansar al-Sharia that were showing local Yemenites having access to electricity in the summer, having access to electric fans, thanks to the job of Al-Qaeda, the men of Al-Qaeda. Additionally, Al-Qaeda was engaged in the provision of security. There was even an emergency line, a phone number that people could call in case of security emergencies. Provision of education, even if it was mostly exclusively Quranic education. Resolution of disputes through a radical interpretation of Sharia. And it also created a Hizba religious police that had the task of patrolling the street and making sure that people were behaving as prescribed by the group. In fact, Al-Qaeda imposed regulations such as the prohibition of listening to music. It was compulsory to go to mosque and attend prayer 5 times a day. Shops had to close during prayer time. Western clothes could not be worn. Women were not allowed outside of the house, if not for specific reasons allowed by the group, and so on. So in other words, what was observed in Yemen as the Arab Spring protests spread across the country was a textbook definition of state weakness, which is the necessary precondition for armed non-state actors to wage an insurgency against the government or join an already existing insurgency, conquer populated territories, and create upon those territories an alternative socio-political system. This phenomenon is known as rebel governance and was observed in the context of the Arab Spring also in other countries, most notably Libya and Syria. In fact, the Arab Spring opened a space of state weakness that many Salafi-Jihadist groups managed to exploit. And this, however, and importantly, was not observed exclusively with Salafi-Jihadist groups, even though this is the focus of my research, but also in the case of ideologically different groups. And in this regard, we can think of the Kurds in northeastern Syria, for instance. But going back to Yemen, Al-Qaeda's experiment in governance did not last long because this harsh interpretation of Sharia that the group imposed did not encounter clearly the favor of the local population. It was very much disconnected with the customs of the local Sunni tribes. And therefore, there was an alliance between local tribes and the new Yemeni government of President Hadi. However, even if they managed to oust Al-Qaeda temporarily, the group was not really defeated, or at least not for good. And in fact, it managed to rise again in 2015 when the Houthis launched an insurgency against the government in Sana'a, and the country collapsed into a civil war and yet another wave of violence. So again, in 2015, same story. Al-Qaeda waged an insurgency, joined the insurgency, conquers territories in southern Yemen, and manages to govern those territories until April 2016, when it is ousted by a coalition of Yemeni, Emirati, and American forces. Today, Al-Qaeda is no longer in direct control of territories, but it does retain a presence in peripheral areas of Yemen. And most importantly, Yemen remains an extremely weak country with a government in exile in Saudi Arabia, an ongoing civil war that is not getting any closer to resolution. And this means that the conditions that were back then at the time of the Arab Spring, when Al-Qaeda managed to conquer territories and present itself as a governor, are still there, which means that a resurgence of Al-Qaeda as a rebel governor cannot be fully excluded. And I will stop here and we leave the floor to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. That was excellent. So, Ahmed.
Yes.
Your turn.
Thank you, Professor. If I may, I want to share my screen with you as well. Sorry. I'm trying, but I don't know what is happening. But anyway, until it will, I send the file for you and for Jennifer. If you don't mind, share it as well. I think I have a problem with mine.
Okay.
Sorry for that. First of all, thank you very much, Professor, for the invitation, and thanks for MECACS, Middle Eastern Studies Institute, for this invitation, and for everyone who talk and everyone is attending. Thank you very much for showing up. And today I will talk about counterterrorism and human rights in the Arab world after the Arab Spring. And this presentation is a glimpse into my new book on counterterrorism and human rights after the Arab Spring with Roundtable Critical Terrorism Studies, which will be published late this year. I would like first to start with remembering all the victims and those who sacrificed their lives for what they believed in عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, which is bread, freedom, and sexual justice, the slogan of the Arab Spring 2011. Coincidentally, today, or a few days ago, it was the 5th anniversary of the Italian scholar Giulio Regeni. I have a photo for Regeni, who had been roughly and brutally murdered and tortured and murdered by the police in Egypt. Regeni was 28 years old, a scholar in Cambridge University who was working on trade union in Egypt, and he has been killed in 2016. I'm sorry, I still can't upload my presentation, but I hope you can see it if you have it. I share it with you in the messages. Also, before I start talking about my topic, I would like also to say to comment about the event, especially the poster, because the poster is showing a group of tribal men with guns, and the 2011 moment was all about civil protest, and there is nowhere of arms or militia or terrorism or all this main discourse now, all the mainstream discourse that dominates the talk about the Arab Spring. And it's really reflect what the mainstream media want to people to believe. This is what Arab Spring after 10 years now. And the other thing also from the book, that the main discourse and the main discussion about the Arab Spring, it's either on the state or by the state. So it's either, and even today, like it's about the state authority, about the external intervention, about state weakness, about action by the state, even taking into consideration the Arab Spring was merely a people-driven action or a people-driven activist against the state with capital S. And now all the discussion we have, all the seminars and workshops we attend, it's all about the state, neither about the resistance nor about the people themselves. Having said that, this presentation will highlight, based on my own personal experience as one of the millions of people who have been honored and have the privilege to take a part in the revolution in 2011 in Egypt, and based on my ethnography and fieldwork in several Arab countries, Egypt, Yemen, Oman, Bahrain, and Tunisia since 2011. Today, I will talk about the way Arab state and authority, and I use state/authorities to differentiate between the society or the community and the people in power. So how the Arab state authorities systematically employed counter-terrorism and the discourse about war and terror as an excuse to repress and uphold the Arab Spring since 2011. From day one, the Arab state created and manufactured a grand narrative that labeled the revolutionary movement and the people who participate in them as terrorists from day one. Pro-Al-Qaeda, like Aisha kindly mentioned, and anarchist, etc. I still remember when I was in Tahrir Square in 2011, how the Egyptian national media and television was creating the reality and portraying the image of the square and the revolution as being terrorist or as a member of Muslim Brotherhood who have been after 2013 had been labeled and called terrorist group or terrorist movement. That wanted this portraying or this narrative wanted to destroy the country and promote instability in the region, the revolution or the uprising. The same discourse was completely copied and pasted into other countries such as Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Libya, and even during the second wave that had taken place in 2018 and 2019 and 2020 in countries like Algeria, with Sudan, with Lebanon, and other countries. It's like 10 years and the same narrative had been produced and reproduced. The book also shows that most of the Arab countries either released new legislation and laws or upgraded their anti-terror laws after the revolution of 2011. And you will see a table that most of the Arab countries since 2012, at least 18 of 22, 23 Arab countries released new anti-terror law after the revolution. Most of the post-2011 anti-laws comparing with pre-2011 and particularly the post-September 11, 2001 were mainly a response to the uprising, not to the pressure from outside as the moment of 2001 and 2013 war in terror. And this external pressure was mainly from the US or from the European Union in particular. This time, the 2011 moment, the laws were from within and mainly aimed to abort and crush the revolution and the political opposition. At 2001, most of the dominant tone was we are fighting terrorism. Those are not democratic, they are terrorists, and so on. The same narrative, the same discourse was repetitively in 2011 as well. That the people in the square, either in Tahrir Square, in Al-Lu'lu'a Square, in any square in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, had been labeled as terrorists. Bashar al-Assad calls them terrorists. Al-Gaddafi calls him many names. The list one was Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden followers. The vast majority of the post-2011 anti-terror laws, if not all, are fundamentally draconian, repressive, and contradict international law norms and values. These laws are systematically violating basic human rights and civil liberties, like one country, which is at the center of the book, is Egypt. In less than 4 years after the 2013, Egypt now have more than 100,003 political prisoners in just 4 years. This will give you a glance about how anti-terrorists, and most of them were detained and imprisoned because of the anti-terrorist law of 2014 and 2015. Most importantly, these laws have been used to demonize political opposition and crushing civil society and silencing the free media under the name of fighting terrorism, where most of the political and social forces accused of being either Muslim Brotherhoods, especially after the 2013 coup in Egypt, or as a terrorist movement in general, whereas like 6-7 of the presidential candidate against Sisi had been imprisoned or detained or forcibly disappeared under the name of counter-terrorism. According to these laws, the police forces, the army, and the counter-terrorist forces are unbound and unaccountable by any legal or constitutional restriction. The laws give these forces a carte blanche and a complete immunity against persecution or trial because of their action and violation during duty. So actually, what happened in Egypt, for example, in Sinai, is never going to be persecuted. Every violation of human rights under the name of counter-terrorism, we will never see the justice. Like I have to mention a name, is a very dear friend. I know him, Ismail Iskandarani. Ismail now spent 15 years in jail since 2015 because of his writing about counter-terrorism and human rights violation in Sinai, and had been sentenced for 15 years in military prison in Egypt. And Ismail is just a scholar like Regina, but Egyptian. And instead, on the regional scale and international scale, instead of pacifying the domestic and regional situation, these laws contribute to the spread and the proliferation of terrorist groups across the region. In a country like Egypt as well, for instance, the number of terrorist attacks between 2013 and 2017 had increased tremendously. And also you will have you will see a photo or a graph from a Tahrir Institute for Strategic Study in Washington about how the number between 2010 until 2013 was almost zero, whereas there is no terrorist attack in Egypt, despite the fact that the central government, the central authority was absent. But since 2013, when this narrative started to dominate and the restore of the state, but the contradictory happened with the terrorist attack was into the sky. Basically, because of the anti-terror laws and the associated discourse and narrative it creates against the political opposition, especially the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists in particular. The same logic also can be easily applied to other countries such as Libya, Yemen, and Syria. How was Bashar al-Assad until now? The main discourse is it's either me or chaos again, or the Islamists like Mubarak in 2008 and 2009. In fact, the false claims of fighting terrorism were also one of the main sources of regional tension, especially between the GCC country or the Gulf state. And they just tried to finish the crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, and UAE since 2013, where the same discourse also have been employed as a political tool to manage the regional competition amongst the emerging power in the region, which is UAE and Qatar in particular. Again, I will refer to Aisha, she highlights this point, and the other power in the region like Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel, which led to the instability of the region and a tough media Cold War and low tense warfare, a proxy war among these competitors in the countries like Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen.
Can you finish up, Ahmed?
Yes, I will, Professor. The last point is overall, and to summarize, since 2011 uprising, both the old and the counter-revolution forces have systematically relied on the discourse of anti-terrorism as the main instrument to repress and abort the democratic transition in the region. And I also have a photo of how this discourse had been created and normalized and institutionalized in media. In fact, and the last word, in fact, the book shows that these anti-terror laws were nothing but anti-democracy laws that aimed basically to suppress what happened in 2011 and guarantee it will never repeat again. Thank you, and I'm sorry if I...
Thanks, Ahmed. That was great. So, Jasmine.
Hi, okay, you can hear me and see me, I think, yeah. First of all, thank you, thanks Ray, and thank you to Jenny and Fiona as well, who worked hard to put this together, and to all of the previous speakers. And my presentation, I think actually, Ahmed, your presentation was very helpful, and I think some of the themes do connect. I want to situate the uprisings 10 years ago within a more global context, and to think retrospectively about the Western discourse about the uprisings, the extent to which Western discourse and reactions had any bearing as well on the trajectory of the uprisings. I think it's quite easy to see it just as narrative, just as discourse. Why should it have any implications? But actually, I think it did have an impact in terms of the progress of the uprisings. So the other thing I would say is I would put forward the notion that we can't really understand Western reactions and discourse in relation to the uprisings without considering it as a part of a longue durée history, right? First of all, harking back to the Cold War and what the end of the Cold War represented for the West, but actually also tapping into a much deeper ideological architecture about Western perceptions of the Middle East. So there are three phases, right, of Western responses to the uprisings. The first is shock, and there's nothing unusual about that. Everyone was shocked, even Middle East analysts, people in the region were shocked, surprised by the events. They were spontaneous, although there were long-term factors that contributed to it. The manner in which those uprisings occurred, yes, it was very surprising. But there are deeper meanings to the shock that was expressed by Western states, governments, and even the media and the public. The second reaction is this almost immediately after they had overcome the shock was this euphoria and celebration of the uprisings, and this desperate attempt to provide some kind of a label on the uprisings, to provide some kind of a meaning of what the uprisings represented and also the direction that they might take. And then the final phase was not just disappointment, but deep pessimism about the uprisings. So these three phases all, sorry, London sound effects, these three phases all reflect different aspects of how the West actually perceived itself and the way in which it sought to see the Arab uprisings through that lens. So in terms of how does it relate back to the end of the Cold War, doesn't seem like an obvious connection. Actually, if you look at some of the literature academically that was emerging 1989, 1990, 91 to 92, anticipating the collapse of the Soviet Union and the potential spread of democracy. So you had quite a lot of literature, the obvious ones like Fukuyama's statements about the end of history that was predicting the spread of liberal ideology, but that was also matched or mirrored by realist literature, the most obvious one being Huntington's book, where I've lost the third wave, democratization in the late 20th century, right? So that's published in 1992. And this discourse plays quite an important role in constructing this idea that democracy will spread in waves. And so then what you have is scholars observing what's happening in South America, observing what's happening then in the mid-1990s in East Asia, in South Asia as well. And there seemed to be actually this prediction seems to be coming true that democracy is spreading in waves in different parts of the world from this epicenter, liberal epicenter in Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you have this watershed, ideological watershed, where the entire globe is working towards this progressive moment. And what that does actually, when the Middle East doesn't seem to be following this pattern of democratization that's apparently happening on a global level, that it feeds into the notion of exceptionalism of the Middle East. And so you have Middle East scholars who are actually very aware of the nuances, the history, generally have took quite a sensitive approach to the politics of the Middle East, wouldn't homogenize the region. Nevertheless, did have these blanket statements that fed into the idea that the Middle East was exceptional. Jubin Ghudazi, whose work I deeply respect, written on the Syrian-Iranian relationship, he spoke about public opinion being a non-issue, for example, in Syria. Eva Berlin, in actually an oft-cited article, and this was written in 2004, speaking on authoritarianism in the Middle East, argued, nowhere in the region do mammoth cross-class coalitions mobilize on the streets to push for reform. Consequently, the costs of repression are relatively low. And she asks also in the article, why have the Middle East and North African states remained so singularly resistant to democratization? Right. So this feeds into the idea that democracy is inevitable. And the fact that the Middle East hasn't democratized is somehow weird, it's singular, it's strange. And that explains why there's such a shock when the Arab uprisings occur at the end of 2010. Initially, there wasn't really much attention paid to it in Tunisia, but then once Egypt joins the ranks of states engaged in the uprisings, then there's a shift, right? To suddenly Western commentators were very eager to talk about there being a wave of democratization in the Middle East. So this is where the euphoria comes in. And this is why it's also a reflection to some extent of how the West wanted to perceive itself. That finally the democratizing project which had up until this point failed in the Middle East, had now arrived in the Middle East. And it was very much you could see a lot of the discourse was attempting to pigeonhole the uprisings within a Western narrative. And so, for example, you have multiple articles, too many to count, that want to see the Arab uprisings as the Arab 1989. Trying to associate it with the Velvet Revolutions. And so you have, I'm just going to read a couple of these headlines out. The Huffington Post asked, is this the beginning of a trend? And then directly compares it to 1989. Then you have in Al Jazeera, English, the Arab world's 1989 revolution. In The Guardian, for example, there's a comment that's made, if this is the young Arabs 1989, Europe must be ready with a bold response. There are some commentators, like in the International Spectator, also in the Washington Post, where there was pushback against this comparison, but instead of it being 1989 that Western commentators were comparing the Arab uprisings to, it was 1968, or it was even going as far back as 1848. The point being is that the Arab uprisings couldn't be understood except as some kind of continuation of this Western project, a liberal project of democratization around the world. And therefore it had to also follow some of the patterns of Western democratization. And what did that do? What were the implications of that? It meant that the Arab uprisings were not allowed to be messy. Right? It's interesting that in the West, it was given the term Arab Spring, whereas often in the region, the word that was used was thawra, which is revolution. There's a lot more conflict involved. It's a much longer process. It's not just a peaceful process that you don't, where almost overlooks the dangers involved in the agency in the revolutions. And so in Western commentary, there was a desire to see it as a liberal project. When that liberal project was not transpiring, then what you see is quite a quick reaction to then portray it as something negative. So my time is almost up, so I'm going to finish off by talking about the way in which almost a month later, after the Egyptian uprisings, Der Spiegel, for example, asked in an interview with Mohammed al-Baradei whether Egypt was in danger of descending into a civil war because the process didn't look as neat and as tidy as Western analysts had expected. And by 2012, you had widespread commentary and headlines asking, has the Arab Spring turned into an Islamist winter? So it suggests to us that the uprisings were only seen as benign and as positive, as something to be celebrated if they followed a liberal trajectory. But if there was any other ideological attachments to those uprisings, or if it didn't seem to follow the same trajectory of the springs that we had seen in Europe or other parts of the world, then there was a deeply pessimistic outlook, and that was adopted. So finally, does that have any implication for the politics of the uprisings or what happens in those countries? I think actually a number of the presentations that we've had talk about the internalization of this narrative of the uprisings could be hijacked by Islamists. Actually, if you topple these authoritarian regimes, for example, Ola mentioned this in Syria, Ahmed talked about this in Egypt, it was very easy for those authoritarian regimes to instrumentalize that language, to demonstrate that actually stability and maintaining authoritarianism in these countries is actually better, not just for the people within the countries, but also for the West, because of the dangers of terrorism that might be exported. So yes, I would conclude by saying we need to see the uprisings, at least in terms of the Western discourse on it, and therefore also Western academic discourse on it, in the context of a long history of European and American perceptions of the Middle East, but then also to consider the ways in which that was both internalized and produced pressure on the people who engaged in those uprisings to conform to a particular image of what the uprisings are meant to be, but also the way in which it was also instrumentalized by authoritarian regimes for their own interests. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine. That's great. Okay, so we do have some time for questions. I'm going to take several questions. Please, or comments, please be brief, and then we'll let the panelists respond. And if there's time, we'll have a second round. So please use the raise hand function if you want to speak. If I don't see you, speak up. What? No questions raised?
There is one in the chat for Ola specifically.
Yes, whoever wants to speak, please do.
Yeah, I have a question for Ola. Can you elaborate on the specific elements that you measured for Syrian identity?
Okay, we'll let Ola think about that, see if there's anybody else that can pose a question. I'd like to take a few before the panelists respond. If I'm not seeing you, speak up, please.
I've just raised up my hand, but unfortunately...
Yes, I see it. Guevara?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've just raised up my hand, but unfortunately I did not participate in the roundtable discussion because I've just finished one seminar some few minutes ago. So I just joined this roundtable discussion less than a minute or even two ago. So I wouldn't be able to know exactly what to ask, but I do know that it takes on the issue of the Middle East. And I have some questions in relation to the issue not in the Middle East, but in what people call Africa today. Since in the northern part of Africa, places like Libya, and its relations with the situation in Syria. I've actually written a paper on it. So I want to know the difference between the general approach to the Middle Eastern, to the Syrian problematic, and the approach to the Syrian, to the Libyan situation. Because if you see the destabilization in Libya is actually being repeated as it was happening in the Syrian question. The very forces who were sponsoring the divisions in Syria and the terrorists in Syria, they are the very same people sponsoring the terrorists inside Libya today. So I just wanted to know the link between these two incidents and whether or not you've discussed on that.
Okay, maybe that's one for Josephine, but Tom Freeburn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I had a question particularly for Dr. Gani. And I wanted to ask what can be done to break or at least lessen the cycle of Western discourse dominating the narrative about these Middle Eastern uprisings and kind of Middle Eastern politics in general? And is that something that's possible to do or not? If so, how? Thank you.
Is there anybody else, or shall I go to the panelists?
Can I ask a question? Even though I talk, I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead. You'll be the fourth.
I'm sorry. Another question for Jasmine as well. You kindly mentioned that correlation between the Cold War and the Arab Spring. To what extent do you think it's more related to the post-2001 and 2003 in particular, the Greater Middle Eastern Initiative and the promotion of democracy and new conservative plan to promote democracy in the region, and the Iraqi war more than it's about the moment of 1989? Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll go to the panelists. Ola, I think you'll perhaps take the first question about identity.
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. So about Syrian national identity, I guess. So after the uprising, not the revolution, because I call it uprising, back to your comment about uprising and revolution, Professor Ray. Anyway, so both the regime and the secular opposition trying to reconstruct Syrian national identity using material structure like media and also like education. As I said, the curriculum, the regime for the first time ever created a new curriculum to teach about the Syrian modern history and also the recent history, like national figures who play football, for instance. So this is very new to Syrians to learn about Syria, because usually the curriculum was created in a way to emphasize the Arab nationalism identity, like being Syrian, be proud because you're more Arab than Arab themselves, because we're the beating heart of Arab nationalism. But after this change in the identity balance, the regime wanted to reproduce Syrian national identity, so try to use symbols like the territorial map, and also material structure like education and media. So many songs, even movies, was created to...
Looks like the snowstorm's at it again, Ola. Well, maybe we'll come back to Ola. Josephine, did you want to address the comparison between Syria and Libya? Does anybody hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Josephine, can you hear?
Josephine, you are mute.
Can you hear us, Ola? Okay, let's go to Jasmine and we'll come back.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yes,
yes we can. Yes.
Two big questions. Tom, how can that pattern of trying to impose a Western narrative onto, the uprising in this case, be avoided? I think recognizing the complexity of the region, and that necessitates a historical approach. For example, Eva Bellin's statement is a really weird one. She says, "No, where have we seen in the region, people coming together in mass protest, and therefore the consequences of protest are relatively low." That's just odd, right? There had, even prior to the uprisings in the 2000s, there had been political protests in the region, but then that also overlooks protests, not just against the Arab regimes, but also anti-colonial protests that had occurred throughout the 20th century. So protest, and even revolution, is very much a part of the Middle East's history. And there are repertoires there that protesters had drawn upon, right, from recent and further history. So that sort of historical depth would have meant that the region was allowed to have greater ownership over the narrative and the trajectory that the uprisings took, without having to foist a Western narrative or a Western pattern, as if the region had no idea of what protesting against authoritarian regimes means, and therefore they have to learn from Europe, or we have to provide labels that come from Europe. Right? The Middle East had its own history. We didn't have to turn to 1989. Why weren't we looking at 1979, for example? Like, Iran's just next door to these countries. The other way in which I think that sort of the blanket homogenization could be avoided is by, again, recognizing the complexity and the differences between the different countries. So to some extent, the anticipation that the Assad regime would fall in Syria was because there's an assumption that, well, if it happened in Tunisia, then and it happened in Egypt, then of course Syria is going to be next. Whereas there are structural differences in those countries, differences in terms of the relationship between the state and the military, differences in terms of their foreign policies, difference in terms of the extent to which neoliberalization had changed and affected social contracts in those countries. Actually, Ray was, I'm sorry, I don't mean to embarrass you, but Ray was one of the scholars that was looking at those deeper complexities, but that analysis had started long before the uprisings. Gregory Gauss is another who's actually asking the question, Catherine Della Cora, what about the role of the military and how might that shape the trajectory? So those who were looking at some of these structural factors over a long period of time were asking the right questions, but some of those, not skepticism, but hesitation and thinking that these are going to be widespread changes, like a domino effect, was to some extent smothered out amidst the wider euphoria. And I would also say that it's not just from the West, right? There was a lot of imagery and and people should be allowed to have that level of optimism, sharing of articles or hashtags even on Twitter that demonstrated the uniformity and the unity amongst the Arab states, that also fed into the idea that there would be this domino effect. So some of that, the challenge to that homogenization needs to come from the region as well. Very quickly, so others have a chance to ask questions. Ahmed, that's a great point. Thank you for making it. I don't think we should overlook the apparent watershed of 9/11 and how much consideration should we give to it rather than the end of the Cold War. I think it's interesting, but not in the sense that the uprisings fit into the narrative of 9/11, but that it was seen as a way of challenging some of the Western narratives after 9/11 and the Iraq War. So that's why a lot of liberal analysts actually from a benign place are wanting to argue, oh, well, after 9/11 and the neocon agenda in the United States, there was this policy to forcefully democratize the region, because if the West didn't do that, it would pose a threat to the West. And so a lot of liberal analysts are arguing, well, you don't need to forcefully impose democracy on these countries, because actually, if you give them opportunities and you stop supporting these authoritarian regimes, the people themselves will be able to rise up and take agency to facilitate democracy from the bottom up. So I think 9/11, what happened after 9/11 is an important part of the story, but I think actually in many ways the Arab uprisings disrupted some of the historical narrative of 9/11, as opposed to, for example, being in continuity of some of the narrative post end of the Cold War.
Great. Josephine, are you still with us? Josephine. Well, maybe not. We do have a few more minutes, and I see there are still 57 guests or 57 participants in the seminar. Surely there's somebody who'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to address the panel.
Ray, this is Maria. I have a question.
Go ahead, Maria.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for all the panelists. It was incredibly interesting to hear your presentations. I actually have another question for Jasmine, but anyone who wants to respond, please feel free to. Just to say, I found your presentation very interesting and spot on in terms of like the power of discourse. And I've also in past research actually looked at how the Syrian regime internalized the Western discourse to kind of portray the opposition as this, hardcore, barbaric Islamist rebellion, and in what way that like would pose an immediate threat to the international order. But like when I look back on that, I wonder if discourse actually has the type of impact that we think it does when it comes to influencing policy. So just to give an example, I mean, we saw several, and you addressed this, Jasmine, we saw several authoritarian regimes attempting to vilify the uprisings and opposition groups. But despite those attempts, we also saw, the Obama administration speaking up in favor of the uprising. It took some time, but indeed he did ultimately ask Mubarak to step down. And we also saw the West, quite quickly unify against the Syrian regime, despite, the repeated attempts by the Syrian government to, again, vilify the opposition. And this fact, or those examples perhaps make me wonder if discourse actually has the type of influence that we think it does. So it's a question and a comment, I guess. But thank you, everyone.
I'll take another question if there's anybody.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, I can hear you.
My question's for Dr. Gani. It was just to say that in regards to the Western perceptions, obviously the West has always presented Arabs who insist on running their own affairs as fanatics and extremists and terrorists. So I was just wondering, do you think that perhaps leaders in the Middle East who have been seen to be supporting their own people and have actually changed the opinion of citizens to go against their leaders and therefore not fit with nations and those in the global north?
Shall I?
Yeah, go ahead, Jasmine.
I apologize, Josh. You broke up a bit, so I missed some of your question, and maybe you could put it in the chat and then I can read it more clearly. But thank you for that. Maria, thanks. That's a really interesting question. I agree. I don't think we should overplay the importance of narrative and discourse. And it should always be, the impact should be taken into consideration with material factors, the way in which foreign policies are very difficult to change, right? So they're quite fixed historically. So that has a bearing. For example, take the Obama administration. It did take a while for him to actually come out in support of the uprisings, and part of the reason for that was because of the strong alliance between Egypt and the United States. A lot more willing to come out in condemnation of Assad and actually to call on him to step down because there was long-standing antipathy. So these things have an impact and shape the discourse as well. But in terms of, I've lost my train of thought. With the Obama administration and the extent to which they were, completely lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. Remind me of the question again, Maria.
I mean, I think you've addressed it already. I was just really questioning, whether discourse actually has the impact, at least on policy, as we think. Because some of these, Western governments did in the end support the uprisings, despite the kind of attempt by the authoritarian regimes to vilify them.
Yeah, no, thank you. I had a complete mind blank. It's just been a long day of teaching, so thank you for reminding me. In many ways, though, when the West came out in support of the uprisings, it still fed into a particular narrative about the West as well, right? That's what I meant in my previous answer, that there are divisions within the West, but in terms of how they wanted to perceive and interpret what was happening in the Middle East. But those divisions are very reflective of an intra-Western debate, right? And so when Obama and other Western states came out in support of the uprisings, it was because it was a way of demonstrating, you see, a narrative of democracy works, and it has finally spread to the region. So it still was about saying something about a liberal agenda and the potential that exists in the optimism, right, of a liberal agenda for the Middle East. So it wasn't about, of course, it didn't always, a Western Orientalist narrative doesn't always mean that it's going to be denying people in the region agency, but it's a way of feeling good about themselves to some extent as well. And when it appeared to be the case that you might have had forces coming to power that didn't really want to have a cozy relationship with the West and might be questioning that, in fact, then you saw some of that approval actually being withdrawn, right? So it's always within that context of Western interest, yes, but also to some extent ideology. And then, yeah, I didn't fully get, Josh, I'm sorry, the sound was cutting out.
I've typed it in the chat, if you could maybe see that better.
I can't. Can someone read it for me? Because for some reason I can't read it.
Right, I'm not seeing it. Before we end the session, would any of the other panelists like any of the questions that have been raised, questions on identity, intervention, the West, etc.?
Yeah, can I say one last thing, because I was disconnected thanks to the snowstorm?
Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry again. It's just the snowstorm is so bad here. Anyway, so as I was saying, it's Syrian national identity is being reproduced both from the opposition, the secular opposition, and also from the regime as kind of umbrella, maybe identity that would include all Syrians instead of Arabism. However, would it include all Syrians, Syrianism? Would it include Islamists? Is yet to be seen. Like only the opposition, only the secular opposition who's trying to promote Syrianism. Islamic opposition are not trying to promote this. They're trying to promote different version of Islamic identity, like Sufi identity, Salafi identity. So just to make it clear, it's only the secular opposition that trying to promote the using also material structure and symbolic factors. Thank you.
Thanks, Ola.
Can I say something about the discourse and policy? If we have time.
Yes.
No one wants to talk.
Go ahead, Ahmed.
Yes, thank you. Regarding Maria's question about to what extent this discourse about supporting democracy related to the realpolitik or real world policy, I will just refer to two recent books, which is Obama biography in White House and Hillary Clinton. For instance, like Obama said, until Mubarak stepped down, they don't have a clue what is going on in the country. So what is this revolution is about? Who is the driving forces behind? How we can deal with it? Should we talk to the military, which are the most powerful institution and the long-standing or long history aligns with the state? And on the other hand, with Hillary Clinton, when she was talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and 2012 and 2013 change that took place in Egypt, still like they by the United States, U.S. administration, EU government, because of this disconnection with what is happening on ground, because the relation is from above. There is no connection with the community or the society. They only focus on the official actors. And I think until now, if you look at this restoration, like back to what Raymond kindly mentioned at the beginning, the restoration of authoritarian, that give you a glance what is exactly this discourse is related to reality. There is a huge gap what the officials said and what the reality, like Jasmine just mentioned, that foreign policy is very grounded establishment. It's very hard to change. We have interest. If this democratization transition contradict with what we have on ground, I'm sorry, we will not support anyone. What happened in Egypt, what happened in Syria, and also like very good piece on New Yorker, what is the debate within the Obama administration about Assad in 2015. Should we intervene or not intervene? Most of the intelligence said we need to intervene because it's a anything close to human genocide, but still because the geopolitics talk contradict with the discourse, so they choose to step back and leave the Syrians suffer. And this is exactly the same with every single Arab Spring case that happened since 2011. If the discourse contradict with the interest, no one will care about what happened in the ground. Either in the Arab Spring, look at Belarus, look at Ukraine, look at Georgia, look at every single country in the global south. It's always the discourse must condense with the interest. If it's contradict, it's not about democracy.
I see a hand up. Alistair, go ahead. Alistair, are you here?
Sorry, Ray, I was muted. Thank you, Ray. Sorry. Very quickly, Ola, thank you. I enjoyed all of the panelists. But if the snowstorm has abated in New York, Ola, there was one slide that you were showing just when it was cut off, when you were talking about the demise of Arabism. And it was, Ya Arab was then shortened to Ya Rab. And I was rather intrigued and I rather liked that image and that symbol. Could you pick up on that slide and just tell me what was the issue, or was it to do with symbolism or language or a bit of both? I don't know if Ola was ready to get that one or.
Are you there, Ola?
Trying to share the screen again. I don't know if you can see it.
Very good.
Yes. Can you see it?
Yeah, no, I can see me. Okay.
I saw.
Okay, and
now we're seeing it.
Excellent. So yes. So it changed, like this was in 2012, I guess. So the kind of the beginning of the uprising, where anti-Assad Syrians were very disappointed by the stances of Arab state, and it just kind of symbolized what happened, going from Arabism to Islamism, from Ya Arab to Ya Rab. Oh God. Okay, my kids will attack me. I'm sorry if you hear anything. Adam, I'm speaking. Hi. My God, no, Adam, can I speak? Okay, no school. So yes. It was kind of the beginning of the uprising, 2012, where protests were still taking place and where protesters were very disappointed by all the stances, and they were kind of calling the help of God. Like, now we don't, Hi! Adam, talking, go to your daddy. روح عند بابا. Sorry about that. روح عند بابا. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think I made the point. Good.
Yeah, that was interesting. I just love that play of words and the symbolism of it. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're more than welcome. Good to see you.
Well, before we sign off,
Tanzania, by the way, where I'm speaking.
I give or anything before we sign off.
Hi, Ray. It's Francesco. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to say thank you for the nice event, and it's so nice to see everyone. It's so nice to see all of you. I hope you're all well. Sorry, just this. Bye.
Well, I think it's a fascinating discussion. We've seen multiple snapshots of this very complex phenomenon, the uprisings. It's like the blind man and the elephant, each of which touches a particular different part of the elephant and gets quite a different view of what he's like. But if you put all these snapshots together, you have a kind of kaleidoscope, which just sort of, I think, will whet your appetite for looking even closer, doing more research on the subject. So can I ask everybody to join me in expressing appreciation to our panelists by giving them a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks very much to the panelists.
Thank you.
And
Thank
also,
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam.
Thank you.
Hello.
Okay, Adam.
Hi.
Bye.
Hello.
Hi, Francesco. Say bye to your friend.
Bye.
Oh my goodness, they attacked me.
You should have let them speak.
Professor
I know.
Hindenburg.
I know. Just want to say one last thing, that as Syrian 10 years ago, I didn't even imagine that in 10 years I would be sitting in New York speaking about the uprising. I would imagine myself in the University of Damascus teaching IR theories. But because of so many factors, I'm here in New York, not in Damascus, not in the University of Damascus. So this is what I want just to say as Syrian. I am disappointed, I am saddened, but I am very still passionate about Syria and about Syrian identity and about the future of Syria. It's more about evolution than about revolution, and I do trust Syria and I do trust Syrians, and that's like, I know it's not academic, but just as Syrian citizen who believe in Syria and in Syrians, I do believe in a better future. Maybe not the near future. So that's it.
Bravo, yes.
So 10 years time, you're calling us from Damascus, Ola? Is that the deal?
Yes. Yeah, so I said that 10 years ago, I didn't even imagine that I'll be in New York speaking about the uprising. I would imagine myself in the University of Damascus teaching IR theories. But because of many actors and many factors, the uprising turned to a bloody war. But still, I believe I'm very passionate about Syria and Syrian identity and believing in a better future. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You and we can be your co-authors as well.
Okay, so that's it.
That's very nice. I really hope that we do the 20 years event and you call us from the University of Damascus.
Yes, hopefully, maybe in 10 years we'll be there.
Yeah, when we do 20 years from the uprising, right? So 10 years time from now.
Yeah.
Why we have to
Look, Mama, there's doors.
Yes, please.
Yes, and thank you for everyone, and we'll hope that in less than 10 years, the situation in the Arab world and the Middle East will be better.
Yes. Have a good day.
I hope for 10 years. I hope don't have to wait 10 years until we see all that stuff.
So,
very soon.
did you get an interest in politics already, Ola? Not yet.
Yeah. If these boys keep me alive for the 13 years. Yeah.
Good to see everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Have a good day and you have trip.
you fixed math watch.